Welcome to Over to Europe. This podcast is produced by students of CIVICA, the European University of Social Sciences. I'm your host, Aniket Narawat, a first-year Master of Public Policy student at Hertie School, Berlin. Europe has played an instrumental role in shaping the world we live in. European countries dominated the world in 18th and 19th century. After World War, from 1945 until 1989, there were two dominating powers in the world, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. After fall of Soviet Union in 1989, the USA dominated the world until recently. But today, due to rise of China and other countries, dynamics of the world are changed. We live in a different world order today. In this episode, we are going to explore the role of Europe in the current world and try to understand the relationship of Europe with the rest of the world. We're also going to look at how Europe will make a way for itself in the future. To start, I'm going to discuss the current world order and Europe's approach to it with Professor Mihai Ghigiu. Professor Mihai is a professor of political science at National School of Political Science and Administrative Studies in Romania. Professor Mihai focuses on European foreign policies. Professor Mihai is also Vice-Rector at SNSPA. We are seeing a new world order recently, which is coming because of the rise of China and other Asian countries in the world. Can you just summarize the current world order for us in the context of Europe?
Yeah, I totally agree that it's a totally different world than was in '89, for example, when we had two power, and after that we had just a superpower, the United States. Now we are speaking more and more about a multilateral world, a world where United States, Russia, European Union, Brazil, Asian countries, but also other countries are trying to gain more power, more influence in the international system. Also, we see the United States after the Trump administration that they're trying to be more selfish, that they're trying to understand better what's happening in the world, but in the same time to put their interest on the first place. We see that I don't know how to call it, the alliance between the European states and the United States that was considered impossible to break, that it has a lot of problems. So European Union has to face now a new situation. Her friends, its friends, I don't know how to call it, are not together with them. They don't share anymore the same values, the same ideas. They are asking European allies to pay for their security. As probably everybody knows, United States were and still are the main security guarantee of the European states. But now the situation seems to change.
Europe and America together championed the values of liberal democracy. They championed the values of human rights until now. But with separation of America and Europe to a certain degree, there is a void of carrying this value ahead. What is going to happen with this value? How are these values of liberal democracy, human rights are going to carry it out in the changing world order from now?
I think this will remain the main, let's say, the main ties between the United States and Europe. They had and continue to have a special relation because they share values. It's very easy to have allies, it's very easy to have partners, it's very easy to have an agreement with a country, but it's very hard to share values, to have the same values. Imagine that the United States, since their beginning, they shared with the European countries, with some of them, after that with more of them, the same values, and these values, my opinion is that they are going to continue to be shared and spread in the world in a bigger or a smaller scale. But for sure, they will go further with this cooperation in terms of values. The problem is that we can see in Europe and in the United States that these values are not so sure, not so safe as we thought. We speak about LGBT's rights. We speak about the media right. We speak about the freedom of higher education, of universities. We speak about anti-Semitism. We speak about black and white. We speak about a lot of things that we consider that are clear for the Europeans and for the Americans. And now we see in our life, in our daily life, that it's not so clear, it's not so sure that these rights are here and that they will stay here forever. So I think every day the Europeans and the Americans, they have to prove that they believe in these values, that they want to promote these values in the world, and that the commerce and the money are not more important than values. Because sometimes we have this impression, or I have this impression, that even the Western countries, they are ready to forget for a moment about values when it's about money, about commerce, about commercial ties, and so on and so forth. And the EU, China is the best example for this. European Unions, usually in the common declaration, they are promoting the human rights, the democracy, and so on and so forth. While in the relation with China, they are more, let's say, softer than usual, because the commercial interest it's bigger than the values.
There are conflicts in Ukraine. There are conflicts in Syria. There is Brexit also happening, which is in a way also a foreign policy crisis for both the UK and also for the Europe. Could you just briefly go through each of the conflicts and summarize it for us?
Okay, around Europe, I think we have different kind of conflicts. We are having frozen conflicts that we have them for 30 something years. We can see Transnistria, we can see Nagorno-Karabakh that was warm a little bit this period, and now seems to go also back to a frozen one. We had Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. We had a little bit of fire there in 2008, but now it seems to be frozen again. And it seems that we are going to have a frozen one in eastern Ukraine. So these are let's say, the frozen conflict that the Europeans try to do something, but in the same time, not really. The problem is that they didn't, the European states were not able to agree on a common solution. They try to promote their national interests. For example, in Georgia, if you remember, Sarkozy, at that moment president of France, he went there, he tried to make peace between the Russian and the Georgians, he tried to negotiate, to be the negotiator for the peace, and so on and so forth. But European Union was not really present. France was present, but European Union not so present. In Minsk, when they tried to debate about, they tried to negotiate about the future relation between Ukraine and Russia, the same. Germany and France, they were present, they mediate the conflict, but European Union was, somewhere in the back, not so present. So this is a problem that the European states, they cannot find a common position and to promote it. For example, we have Belarus. It's not a conflict. It may become an internal conflict near the border of EU, and we see that we have some states that they block the sanction against Belarus, that they say, we shouldn't be so harsh with the regime there, and so on and so forth. In Middle East, because you mentioned Syria, but we have problems in Israel, and what's happening what happened, in fact, with the American position there, supporting the demands of Israel. We have the Iran and what's happening now in Iran, and possible conflict there that would be a big issue for European Union, first of all, and after that for the United States. European Union is promoting a multilateral solution. That it's a good one usually, but not so efficient all the time. In all this conflict, they proposed, let's bring all the factors on the table, discuss, like was in the Iranian nuclear file. That was a success. for the moment, because United States decided to withdraw. But for the moment, that was a success. But all the other formats, these multilateral formats, they were not so successful, and I'm not very sure that they are going to be. So the European Union policies about this conflict, we can speak about the conflict in Africa and so on. It was a soft position. First of all, because they are using the Europeans, usually they are using the diplomacy. They are using the soft power. They are using instruments that are not so coercive with these countries. So they prefer soft measures that sometimes are really good, but sometimes they are not working. And for the moment, we see that they are not working. If you ask me what's the solution, I don't know. But for sure, this strategy is not working. And if European Union wants to do something, wants to prove that they are relevant in the international arena, they should change something.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a couple of very interesting points here. One is the undecisiveness of and the inefficiency of the EU when it comes to foreign policy. We need, when it comes to conflicts around the countries, we need strong, decisive leadership, first of all. And second, you talked about EU not taking strong enough stances. You talked about we don't know the solution yet, but let's look at one of the consequences. One of the clear consequences EU had because of the conflicts around it is migration. Because of Syria, it had a lot of migration, and I think it is safe to say after 5 to 6 years of the whole migration, Europe is permanently changed. This is permanently changed. And how has foreign policy affected the migration, and how does EU sees for migration now?
That's a difficult question. Migration, I would say that EU as a whole, as an organization, as a whatever, they are still supporting the migration. They are trying to help these people coming from conflict areas, these people that risk their life to come to Europe for a better life. So in terms of declaration, they are supporting. You see the European Commission, you see the European Parliament that asks countries like Italy or other countries from the south to help these immigrants and so on and so forth. The problem are the states. The states are not ready to accept this phenomena anymore. We saw what happened in Italy with Salvini and his party. We see what's happening in Poland or in Hungary, that they are saying that they are not willing to accept immigrants. EU went to the Court of Justice with these countries, but they continue to say we are sovereign, we don't want them, we don't accept them. Also, we have states that supported this. For example, Germany, Madame Merkel is the best example that she supported this idea. She saw an opportunity also, because Europe, let's be sincere, Europe is getting old, and they need labor force. They need new citizens, new blood. I would dare to say. And Eastern European countries should be more open to the idea, but in the same time, I think we need a totally new policy in terms of immigration. The Dublin I and Dublin II agreements, they never imagined that millions of immigrants will come on the European territory. So we need a new legislation to protect the countries, but in the same time to protect these human beings that are trying to come for a safer place in Europe.
So my last question would be about higher education and alliances like CIVICA. We're going through quite a lot of change happening right now in the world. The world is reshaping itself, and for this kind of reshaping, it happens once in a century, at least what we are seeing right now. It needs a lot of intellectual power. It needs a lot of higher educational power. What do you think about how higher education has a role to play in this, specifically higher education of Europe?
The human resources was and continue to be an important asset for Europe. So the investment in education, and I will put here also research innovation, because I cannot split them. The investment in education and research should be the main focus of European countries. They are not able to compete in terms of production. They are not able to compete in terms of resources. They are not able to compete in many terms, in terms of military power, but they still can compete in terms of intelligence, in terms of human resources, in terms of high qualified human resources. And this investment is an investment for the future, not for 1 year, for 2 years, for 10 years. It's an investment at least for a century. So I think European Union should championship this idea on education, to invest on education and research. They are doing this, but I think I'm teaching also EU policies. And I get upset when I see that a lot of money are going to policies that are important, but are policies of the last century, agricultural and other policies that are important. I'm not saying that they are not important, but we need to invest more money in research, in innovation, in human resources, because this is the only asset that European Union has at this moment. Imagine that after the Brexit, no European universities is in the first 10 for sure. I'm not sure that in the first 20 universities in the world we have no European presence. Without investment in education, Europe has no place in the big actors table. I'm almost sure that in the next 40, 50 years, Europe will be irrelevant if they don't invest in education and innovation. So I fully agree with you that Europe needs education and needs investment in education.
This was Professor Mihai, who helped us understand where Europe stands in the current world. To discuss the future of Europe in the world, we wanted to talk to students who focus on foreign policies and international relations, the future leaders of Europe. I discussed Future of Europe in the World with Lucia, who studies international relations at the Central European University. We also have Francesca, who studies Master of Public Policy at Hertie School, Berlin. And finally, we have Stefan. Stefan is a dual degree student at SNSPA and London School of Economics and Political Science. Europe is surrounded by several disputes around it. You have Turkey in the south, you have Syria nearby, you have Ukraine on the east. There are issues everywhere around Europe. And until now, it was relying heavily on America. It was relying on the tie-ups. Francesca, what do you think about the security issues of Europe? How will they evolve in the future?
I think you're right to point out, especially Turkey. I think Turkey has been sort of bothering a lot of actors lately. And I personally wish that there would be more sort of action on that. Recently, I think about 3 weeks ago, Greece came out sort of imploring Germany to stop, or in general, European nations to stop selling weapons to Turkey, because they were saying, well, those weapons are just being turned on us. And continuing sort of the bloody conflict that's happening in the Mediterranean or in that area. That's not the Mediterranean, that's a different ocean. And so I think it's definitely will be complicated here. The issue is, especially in Germany, there's a massive reluctance sort of to rebuild the military for sort of obvious reasons. I think France might step up and take up the role, and I think they sort of want to, of like sort of the security guarantor of the European Union, now that the European Union has lost the UK, which was quite a large military. And Macron has been known to call for sort of a stronger Europe, maybe a European army, which I think is obviously just going to be sort of a European cooperation between national armies, because a European, like above a supranational army under the EU, I don't think is feasible. And of course, there's also Italy that has quite a strong army, and they have been known to be quite military, like so quite defensive on their security. The issue is with Italy is they're sort of getting increasingly alienated by the EU, mainly due to the immigration crisis.
Yeah, maybe I would add to the whole question of where Europe is going to try to position itself in this sort of new bipolar world. That, first and foremost, I think the key word for Europe will still remain multilateralism. And I think in that respect, it's quite interesting to read this year's interview of Emmanuel Macron with Le Grand Continent, and also last year when he gave his famous interview with The Economist, in which famously he said that NATO was brain dead. And that really neatly aligns with the Commission's program of using multilateral channels to fight for the rule of law, fight for peace and international security in the relevant councils and fora. The problem is, however, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that multilateralism has been dealt a heavy blow by this emergent paradigm embodied by Trump and Bolsonaro, for example. And I say emergent for a reason, right? Because misinformation, failed liberal intervention, and weak support have undermined international institutions. But on the other hand, of course, we need multilateral fora in order to deal with our time's most pressing issues, for example, climate change and the transition to sustainable technology, and of course transnational threats as well. So yeah, in that respect, well, we should hope that the European Union can champion a multilateralist approach and will be backed up by its historic partners.
You mentioned quite important words, rule of law. You also mentioned the democracy, liberal democracy. These values were championed by Europe, and not just Europe, but Western world, America, Europe, but all of the Western world. These values just are not recent values. These values come from French Revolution. These values come from age of enlightenment, and these values were championed by whether it is liberal democracy, whether it is rule of law, whether it is equality, human rights. And military was used to implement these values across the world. What do you guys think about what is going to happen with these values, the values which were cherished, which were implemented, which were propagated until now by Europe and the Western world?
I think we're currently, I'm especially thinking of France. We're seeing, so France was the sort of seat, it's like the nation that sort of birthed the Enlightenment in many regards. And right now in France, we're seeing, I think, what is sort of a concept redefinition of what liberal democracy means to the French nation. And we're seeing there's a rise in anti-separatism laws. Macron recently banned homeschooling, tried to prevent sort of religious schools. And so I think we're starting to understand maybe what are the limits of what liberal democracy really means. And I think the rest of the world is very aware of what sort of liberal democracy means to the West, because we can't ignore the imperialistic legacy. I think one of the biggest examples has been Libya, and also to some degree what's happening with the YPG in Rojava, is they mean one thing for here and another thing for the rest of the world. And they sort of actually enabled the rise of humanitarian military intervention. So what I think, when I was thinking about this question, is one of the most important things that Europe has, which I think all Europeans can speak to, is sort of the European lifestyle, which seems trivial like this, but I think it's a set of regulations and norms that allows for a certain standard of living. And in a way, and yes, it might make it, it makes it less, liberal market competitive. It makes it maybe not be able to compete with some of the, like China, obviously. But I think it's one of the most important things that Europe has, and that it should really be careful in sort of keeping that, because it is what makes Europe special and coveted.
Yeah, I think it's very important to point out that actually even European Union or some of the member states within European Union have troubles with maintaining liberal democracy. So for example, let's look at Hungary. Some even called it illiberal democracy. And I think this is one of the problems of liberal democracy in general, because, you rightly pointed out that it's a Western concept. It was advocated for in Western Europe. But then, for example, right now, European Union is not just Western Europe, although sometimes it may appear it is dominated by Western Europe, but there are other countries. And when liberal democracy, when they were in the time of transition after the dissolution of Soviet Union and, after all the revolutions happening in 1990s, they were striving to get to the European Union. So they were agreeing to accept everything that European Union was requiring them to accept. However, once they got what they want, once they got into the European Union, they started to realize that actually liberal democracy in terms of cultural terms is not what we want. It may be what they want in terms of economic relations, but in cultural terms, it is more problematic. And I think this is what's happening in Hungary, because they were happy to accept the economic point of liberal democracy, but not the cultural one. So that's why you can see the rise of nationalism in these countries and populism, and this rhetoric is gaining more traction in these countries. And you can see that not just in Hungary, but other countries such as Poland as well, where people fear this liberal agenda. So yeah, I think that's important to point out.
Thank you, Lucia. I think you brought up a very interesting perception here, which comes from the Eastern Europe. We often tend to as you said, Western Europe tend to dominate the EU even today. Could you, Lucia, again, a question to you. Could you just tell us a little bit about how Western Europe sees Eastern Europe looks at the world? Because Eastern Europe is comparatively new, like the democratic Eastern Europe is comparatively new. It was formed in 1989. Could you talk about how it used to relate earlier before 1989, how it relates right now?
Basically, for the Central and Eastern Europe, European Union, well, at the time it wasn't really European Union, but this community was something, it was like a dream for them, because human rights were restricted, people were oppressed, they couldn't practice their religion. So European Union was something like a dream for them. And once they gained European Union and joined NATO, they felt like finally we are here. We've rejoined Europe, because prior to the 20th century, these countries were part of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and they felt like we're European countries, but suddenly they were kind of alienated. So they felt like felt this joy that finally we are back where we are supposed to be. But then this kind of sadness came in, because there was this realization that we're still not really conceived as a part of Europe, because we're not Western countries. We're just like the Eastern and Central Europe. So I think this kind of sadness, or I don't really know how to call it, is kind of setting in now. And this is what the political elites are using to, drive the nationalistic fears. And yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on one of the points that Lucia made earlier, just in terms of how the pandemic may reshape the global order. Thinking about this in paradigmatic terms, right? There was an interesting take in the midst of the pandemic that basically argued that rather than alter the course of history, the pandemic and its aftermath would speed up the already existing dynamics. And in that case, that is to say that our 20 years of liberal hegemony might come to an end much more quickly than we anticipated, right? And this, of course, has to do with the demise or decline of the West and the rise of the rest. And what we see, and Lucia has pointed this out, that the illiberal paradigm becomes less and less stigmatized, and the challenge even comes from within, as you said, from Hungary, from Poland, and also from Turkey. And you rightly pointed out that Mr. Orban even takes pride in that. And I think in terms of ramifications for the future, the great risk, in my opinion, is that human rights and liberal values will almost become a concept that applies in this sort of Western bubble only, and it will maybe be rivaled by an illiberal approach that will be very appealing to the rest of the world, maybe because of trade and investment interests. And I think what we should fear for the future is that the values that have been championed in the past may lose their appeal and their universality.
Let's talk about, Stefan, I'll get back to you again. What are the major chunks of the parts of the world which are coming up now? China is an obvious one.
I mean, in terms of I think it would probably be misguided to measure power just in terms of economic growth and share of world trade. And I can see that you guys agree with that. Because also, of course, there is the soft power that accompanies might and power, and also, just the ability to set norms. And that is why I would argue that of all the other BRICS countries, I don't really see contenders that would be able to exercise, soft power to the same degree that, for example, China could in the future. Of course, countries like Russia have tried to make their influence felt in Europe and all over the world in a sort of like return of a geopolitical game ever since roughly 2014, 2015. But yeah, I'm wondering for how long this can go on. I don't really see any other sort of credible, I would call it, challenge for hegemony coming from all of these emerging countries other than China, probably. So I would sort of agree with your take on sort of like a bipolar world, and in between there will be Europe.
I completely agree with Stefan's point on there's also power in sort of who can set norms. And many countries simply can't really set norms. And I'm, for example, thinking a little bit about Latin America, just simply because their governments are still quite unstable and they're still, changing to their constitution, or they're increasing their parliamentary, they're decreasing it. I mean, all these things, which I think prevent them from being to some degree taken seriously. I would say that the one area that is quite stable and I think is potentially very able of setting norms is the Gulf area, which Europe tends to overlook and to not like. But they're stable. They have an alliance. They're reaching out to sort of the rest of Africa. They've also created alliances with all the border countries in Africa to some degree, all the functioning border countries. And so I think that's a potential pole of sorts. I don't think we're going to get to a tripolar world anytime soon. Even getting to a bipolar world, we still have a little bit of roads.
Let's talk about China a little bit now. It is something that is challenging the Western world continuously. It is continuing to challenge now. Lucia, would you want to tell us about how the emergence of China is challenging the Europe and the Western world?
Yeah, so I think it kind of ties back to what we've already discussed with regards to the liberal values and human rights, because China, is successful even without liberal values, even without human rights. They are able to engage economically, politically with multiple countries, and actually they tend to be even more successful in places where USA or Europe hasn't been successful. So I think that's quite a big of a challenge, and also because of the economic interdependence that's happening. So like almost all of the countries have some kind of trade with China, and this is such a huge power that China possesses and can use. So for example, if you look at the EU-China summit that has just happened recently, EU came there with like this strong agenda of what they want to achieve, and actually very little has been achieved. And like, for example, when the EU has pointed out to the violation of human rights in China, the Chinese president just responded, look at the violation of human rights in Europe. Like there are still violations of human rights in Europe. And I think as long as as long as Europe and the US can kind of deal with the issues they have in their own spaces, I think China will still have this leverage towards these countries, because China will always be able to point out the flaws and mistakes, and just like reverse the tables. And so I think China is a big of a challenge for the whole of the world because of this.
Depending on how the world has changed so far, the Europe has to respond to it. It cannot rely on America. It cannot rely on the relationship anymore. It has to create its own strategy, security strategy, which is the grand strategy, and it also has to create its own trade strategy. Help us understand how is Europe going to reframe its strategies, both the strategies, security and the grand trade strategy, to 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 find its place on its own without America in the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a huge question. In terms of security, I think one area that Europe already has a head start is in, to some degree, cybersecurity or anything that would fall under that, specifically data privacy. Um, and I think in the future, as we're moving towards what Davos would call the fourth industrial revolution, with an increased digitization of the economy and an automation of the economy, a lot more attention will be put on data, and that is one area that Europe actually is way ahead of the United States and of most of the rest of the world on talking a lot about data, talking who should have the data, where should be stored. And I think that's very important for itself to position itself in whatever the economy of tomorrow is. Um, as for how it's going to position itself vis-a-vis the United States, only time will tell. To some degree, there will always be a partnership between the U.S. and Europe, simply because of shared immigration, transatlantic history, colonialism, all that. Um, Obviously, the US, and it makes sense, they're going to be pulling away their troops from Europe and positioning them on the West Coast. That's just obvious. And I think it's wrong for Europe to be angry about it to some degree. They also haven't really pulled away their, security from Europe. They've just moved one base from Germany to Poland. It's not really a huge deal. But I think also very importantly for Europe is I would like to see more European, especially like people like us, students who are like into policy and politics, talking about European grand strategy, because I think so far Europe sort of has gotten away with riding on a little bit people's coattails. Germany, especially in terms of security, they don't need to insure their trade routes; they're sort of insured by other people. So just starting to talk about these issues would be massive, and having them taught in policy schools would be huge as well.
What are the areas where Europe can actually lead the world? Francesca already talked about data and cybersecurity. Let's go on to one by one. What are the ambitions? What are the leadership roles Europe can take?
So I think one quite obvious one is climate change. So if you look at Europe, you've got countries that have been, for quite some time now trying to push for reforms and for policies that protect the environment. So for example, you have Sweden, where they have to actually bring in garbage to recycle because the recycle system there is so good. So I think climate change is an obvious one because there's been many initiatives going on to contest this, and it's going to be a big question in the coming future, and also for the next generations, as we're using the planet more and more, and as of now there is no planet B. So I think this is a major issue. And also I remember reading one article where it was kind of like, in order to make trade with Europe, Chinese were willing to make some concessions in terms of the environmental policies in exchange for the trade. So I think this is something the Europe can use to bargain as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what you say, the last point you're saying, the importance of Europe on the regulations, it's quite important because Europe is such a huge continent, and if Europe takes a lead on creating regulations around any sector, it has the leadership, it has the potential to regulate the whole sector for the whole world. Francesca, what do you think? What kind of leadership role Europe can take from here?
So I'm going to give a little bit of a different answer. I think Europe has the potential of demonstrating the importance of regional development. Europe so far has done a very good job, and each nation state as well, of maintaining its countryside and preventing sort of complete economic erosion, which I think is the biggest challenge to at least sort of like liberal democracy as we like it. We're experiencing this huge rural to urban divide that is quite simply exacerbating inequalities to the point where we could have massive problems in our democracies, but also a huge backlash against our economic system. Europe has done a really good job so far of funding regions and helping regions build resilient communities, which I think down the road is going to be the difference between, a happy population and an unhappy population, and an unhappy population would probably vote to leave the EU.
Yeah, I can only echo what Francesca and Lucia have said so far. Obviously, in terms of the Green New Deal, the transition to renewable energy is crucial. Also, Europe will probably try to domesticate its supply chains for critical goods. We've seen this with protective medical equipment, maybe a more resilient global health policy that will prepare us for the next big outbreak. But I would like to end on the notion that, Brussels will be encouraged and also comforted by this new cabinet of President-elect Biden. A lot of Francophone leaders in there, notably Antony Blinken and John Kerry. So there will be support for the next 4 years for all of the agreements and accords that are important to Europe. But beyond that, I think the imperative is that Europe develops strategic autonomy in order not to be surprised once again by any eventuality that happens on the other side of the pond. So strategic autonomy, being able to solve its own problems in the geopolitical sphere, and also, championing multilateralism. I think that will be the ambitions of Europe in the next couple of decades.
That was the vision for Europe by the future leaders of Europe. The world is changing, and how Europe relates to the world also must follow it. We already see changing policies around that in Europe. Let us see what kind of role Europe has to play in the coming times. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Over to Europe is produced by Nicholas Fellows and me, Aniket Narawat, with the help of CIVICA community. Music in this episode was created by Kevin McLeod. This podcast is funded by German Academic Exchange Service. Subscribe and learn more at www.civica.eu/over to Europe. Stay tuned for our next episodes.